morning. How are you? Okay, she doesn't want to talk to me. And I'm going to start sharing, and I'm going to try to remember not to do full screen so that we have to complain and wrestle and everything. Do you not have something to write on? No? Can you give her a piece of paper? Go. All right. So I'm going to start with a little PowerPoint. And I'm just going to show you kind of some of applied stuff first. Oh, I just did it. Okay. Right after I said I wasn't going to do it, slideshow. We'll just play from current slide. Okay. Let me back up. Okay. So in my life drawing class, we do an exercise or a project called Hatched Head, which is like the drawing class, the first exercise that we do that explores value. Because prior to this, in the life drawing class, we've been drawing the skeleton using constructive line and contour line, just like you guys have been doing that with boxes and bottles and compound shapes and things like that. So life drawing kind of follows the same, at least how I teach it, the same regimen as drawing one. The only variance from that is towards the end of the semester when we start working with color. And of course, the fact that we're using the human figure as a subject matter instead of inanimate objects. So the first exercise we do in the life drawing class with value also employs hatching. So this would be an example of a student work that employs hatching to create a sense of light and shadow. And what we did was we, looked up pictures of some of our heroes. This is a Russian artist named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, did I say Russian artist? I didn't mean to say that. A Russian writer slash activist, I guess you would call him, who was put into the gulags of Soviet Russia during the communist era. And he wrote a big book about his experiences in the gulag. So one of my students loved the book and admired the writer, the author of the book. So he did this portrait. But you can see that not only does it have good form as far as looking like a human being that's proportionately accurate and all of that stuff, but it has this sense of light and shadow to it. Now, one of the things that we've talked about in class is how all shapes, no matter whether they're inanimate objects or alive objects like trees or animals or human beings, they can all be replicated using one of the three fundamental shapes: the planar shape, the cylindrical shape, and the spherical shape. So if we look at this portrait here, you can see that his nose is kind of like a cylinder, right? His head is kind of like a spherical form, right? It also has a planar quality to it because it has a front and a side. His beard is very planar. So there's a front side and a right side that we're seeing in this particular drawing. So, when we're looking at the human form, we're seeing some of these fundamental shapes that we learned about during the first part of the class. And we're, of course, making them more complex based on our observations. But essentially, they're the same in form, i.e. planar corners and changes of planes, cylindrical ellipses, spherical roundish forms, curvilinear versus rectilinear etc. And not only does that go for the shapes themselves when we're drawing the human form or any other objects, but it also goes, or it's also the light and the shadow and the application of light and shadow, and how that falls on an inanimate object is going to be applied in the same way when we're studying a human figure. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So we're going to be using the same technique that the students in this class use and that artists have used, which is the hatching technique. So there's a couple different types of hatching. I kind of use hatching as an umbrella term, and there are different variations on hatching underneath that umbrella term. This would be hatching proper, okay? Hatching proper is lines that are parallel to one another. And depending on how close they are together, you'll either get a light tone, a middle tone, or a dark tone, or something in between. And that transitions us into something conceptually that we'll talk about in more detail momentarily, but that is the idea of value, darkness or lightness, and how to quantify that when you're representing a shape in a drawing. Because light and shadow reveals the object much more than line does. In fact, all the lines that you see when you're looking at an object are created by contrast of light and shadow, or contrast of value. So understanding that, for instance, in this particular example, the space between the lines and the lines themselves and the way that they relate to one another as far as distance is concerned creates a certain darkness of shape or value in this case. So if you squint at it, everybody squint their eyes, it's like a kind of light middle gray value. It's grayish in tone. So our eyes kind of fuse all of those shapes, all of those lines into one shape, which is like a, organic kind of quasi-circular oval shape, and that shape has a value. So if we go back to this drawing here, it's the equivalent of the value that you see here in the side of his head, right? So kind of like a light gray value. Does that make sense? Light middle gray. Another type of hatching is cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is when you do lines that are perpendicular to one another, or parallel and perpendicular to one another. And of course, the more you hatch, the more of the white of the page you block out. The more of the white of the page you block out, the darker it's going to appear. So if you squint again at this shape, you'll see that it has a darker part and a lighter part. This lighter part is darker than this, but not as dark as this. And of course, this is the darkest of the three tones that we're seeing there. So this would be more like a middle dark gray, and this would be a dark gray, or a dark middle gray instead of a middle dark gray. I know I'm using a lot of terms that we haven't gotten into as far as discussing in detail, but we will. So just bear with me. If you squint at it, I want you to notice something. If you have your eyes open, it just looks like, a bunch of lines, right, that are either closer together or farther apart. I mean, you can understand what I'm talking about when we're talking about lighter and darker areas of value, right? But so what? Well, if you squint at it, it looks like a form. In other words, it looks like a lighter top and a darker front, kind of like a box. You guys see that? So just by lines that are creating, or this network of lines that are creating varying tones, we get a sense of form. a sense of dynamic form, of light and shadow, all implied not by outline or contour, but by the meeting of one tone and another. And by the way, white is a tone as well. And I just want to say something in brief. The white of the page or the black of the page or the blue of the page, whatever color the page is that you're working on, that's known as the reserve of the page. I think I've used that term before. And when you start drawing on it, you're creating a shape on that reserve, and you're blocking out the reserve with either, you know, your single contour line, or in this case, this network of crosshatched lines. And the more you block out the reserve, it's kind of like turning down the light. The more you leave the reserve showing, you're kind of turning up the light. Does that make sense? So yeah, so that idea of varying degrees of covering of the reserve is where the whole idea of tone comes from. And it happens no matter, you know, what sort of material you're using, be it pencil to create hatching or charcoal to create a tone that's more smooth and subtle. We've already done this, which is contour hatching. We called it cross contour hatching. In this case, it's varying the shape of the line based on the form that the line is being placed on. You know, like a cylindrical form, you wouldn't want to use flat lines. You would want the lines to curve. Does that make sense to everybody? But in this case, the proximity of those lines, like here they're closer together versus here they're farther apart, that creates a slightly darker value than in here, where they're thinner, which has a lighter value, than in here where they're thicker, which creates a darker value, than in here where they're very congested, which creates a very dark value, than in here where they do a directional change and are closer together and they have a different value. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of ways of varying, not only, I guess, the amount of coverage that you're employing using hatching, meaning the amount of the reserve you're blocking out, but also the way the lines move in space or the direction they have in space, be it curved or flat, far apart, close together. That can also block out more or less of the reserve, thinner or thicker lines, etc. All right. So this would be an example of a still life that's using cross hatching and a variety of different hatching techniques, actually. Hatching, cross hatching, and cross contour or contour hatching. And you can see, you know, it's not really about pressure as much as it is about congestion. So here the lines are looser and farther apart versus in here the lines basically block out all of the reserve, and you're not even hatching anymore at that point. You're just filling in with black space versus, you know, the side here, which the lines relative to this are lighter, but relative to this are darker. We looked at Albrecht Dürer the other day. This is a different one by the same artist, a different print. And as we start to zoom in, you can see that it's made up of cross hatching up here, contour hatching in here, and if we get really close, there's hatching proper in here. So notice here, all the lines are parallel. They get closer together as you go into the shadow area. They get farther apart in the light area. And in this area, it's somewhere in between. And the lines are thinner than they are in the shadow area. Here you have the cross contour hatching. You can see that in this case, they're parallel lines instead of cross hatched lines. And as he moves into this furrow, this trough in the horse's neck, the lines become closer together and they kind of take a downward concave trend because it's going into a hole or a hollow, versus in the bulging part of the muscle, they're a little bit farther apart and they curve in the opposite direction. They come out towards you instead of a U-shaped trough. It becomes like a bow-shaped mound. Does that make sense to everybody? And then you can see in here in the lit areas, it becomes what we call stipple, which are just little tiny broken lines, which to me it's basically hatching because they're parallel to one another. It's just the lines are a lot tinier. And in some cases, they can become dots. So in the lightest areas, you see a lot more of the reserve, and it's a light gray. It's not quite white, like here where you have no stipple or hatching whatsoever, or in these areas. Okay. Rembrandt's a famous artist who used hatching and cross hatching, and you can see here there's very little, if any, hatching whatsoever. You get into the hat, into this kind of middle gray, middle light gray, there's hatching, and then you get into these denser areas, there's a lot of cross hatching going on. And some stipple as well that transition us. So there's this gradation from light to dark, meaning a movement in tone from light to light gray to middle gray to darker grays to dark grays to blacks. And it's that transition or modulation that creates form. This is Charles White, and he was a master of hatching. So you can see here, you know, this movement from light gray to a middle dark gray to a dark gray to a black, then back to a dark gray, and then a dark middle gray here. So it's that modulation of tone that creates the kind of planar shape. It's kind of like a box and a cylinder at the same time. These are cylinder shapes. Okay? And because this person has a darker skin tonality, there's less white space, except for in the parts of the face that probably have, you know, oiliness, like the nose and the cheeks, because in those areas you're going to have a kind of reflected light that's much lighter than the skin tone. Does that make sense to everybody? I can't hear you. What? Yeah, it's a highlight, or what we call a specular highlight, which you see on you know, reflective objects like metal or glass. All right. So let's see if I can't get out of here. There we go. All right. Thank goodness. All right, so I'm going to pull up my Word document here, and I'm not going to maximize it. I refuse to get caught into that trap again. So the first thing that we want is we're going to use, and this is part 2 of assignment 4, hatching, and it's just titled Hatching and Value. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to use white paper and a pencil, 4B or 6B. We're going to again use pressure to create lighter or darker lines with the lightness or heaviness of attack, but we're also going to use kind of congestion in order to create a sense of value. And when I say congestion, I mean blocking more or less of the reserve of the page. So we'll call it congestion or density to create varying values Okay, so this idea of blocking more or less of the reserve of the page is all about concentrating our efforts on value or the formal equivalence in drawing of light and shadow. So we're going to imply light and shadow by using a linear network of hatched lines. And as we saw in the PowerPoint, the terms hatching, cross-hatching, I guess I should add contour hatching, and stipple are the techniques that we're going to use. And we're going to use all of them in one drawing. We're going to do this to represent what we see on the objects as far as the course of shadow. And this is kind of a formula that describes the way or quantifies the way or represents the way light illuminates a surface based on the direction of the light and how that direction of the light and intensity of the light can create varying values or intensities of light and shadow. So it's not just light, it's also shadow. And in drawing objects, be they inanimate objects or human figures or trees or buildings, using this formula, applying this formula, requires a movement from a light to a darker value. And this is known as modulation of value. And we're going to start with the sphere, and then we're going to move on to other objects. And this will require not only applying this technique to the positive shape or the figure, what we're drawing, for instance, first the sphere, but also to the negative shape or the background. And you'll see what I mean in a minute with that explanation. All right, I need to plug in my computer because it's going to die if I don't. Okay. All right, so the first thing that I want you guys to know is what we're going to be using as far as materials. And I already said white paper and pencil. One thing that I want you to do is go ahead and put a couple sheets of newsprint down. I put down 5 sheets of newsprint or 4 sheets of newsprint, and then put your white paper on top. And the reason that we do this is because it's going to protect, especially when we get into charcoal, but also with hatching, it's going to protect our drawings from being interfered with by textures that are on the board themselves. Over time, these boards get rough, little bits of paint or the stickiness, or you scratch into it, it creates a trough, and that can interfere with your drawing that's on top. Okay, now in your inbox, I sent a reference of a sphere that you guys are going to be working from. I'm going to use a slightly different one. So when we're looking at an object and it has light on it, it has a movement from one tone to another or from one value to another. So you can see over here a value scale. This is a kind of truncated value scale. You can have a value scale with 1,000,000 steps, or in this case, just 5. But of course, when you move from one tone to another, you create another tone. So in between each one of these steps, as they call them, there are other tones. So for instance, if this is a light gray and this is a white, there's probably a light gray in between that, and then a light gray, and then a light gray. I'm making these terms up. And then we move from a light gray to a light middle gray, or a light middle gray into a light middle gray, and then a middle gray. Or you could go in the opposite direction and say middle gray, middle light gray, middle light gray. It doesn't matter. I'm just making up terms to describe the fact that there's steps of value in between these values when we start using hatching and or shading. I'm going to show you 2 different slides of 2 different balls. This is a white ball. This is a kind of a dark gray, middle dark gray ball. So each one has a different local value. Local value refers to the kind of generic color or value And of course, within that, there are movements of color from light to shadow and back to light again. This is white in its local value. This is middle gray in its local value. Lighter, darker. Lighter object, darker object. So this object has all of these tones and tones in between, whereas this object is going to restrict itself to this range of the spectrum for the most part. It won't go all the way to white. Does that make sense? All right. So with this white object and with a dark object, but in this particular example, you can see the full light. Sometimes it's referred to as the highlight. It depends on whether the object is reflective or not. Then you have the halftone, or the kind of middle value of light. And that's because, in this case, the light is kind of coming from above, and as it moves into that zone, it starts to transition because the surface starts to turn away from the direction of the light. And as it turns away, it gets darker because the light isn't illuminating the surface anymore. Then we move into the shadow zone, which is all along this edge. And you can see when you look at it, it's a very smooth transition. But in between that light and that middle gray and that dark gray, there's a light gray. And between the middle gray and the dark gray, there's a dark middle gray. You follow, there's these modulations in between each of the values. It's not as simple as just blocking in those 5 values. And then we get into, and here it's not really talked about, but the densest part, which is right in here, is called the core of shadow. And I think, yeah, it shows it on this ball. The core of shadow versus the shadow. So I would add, shadow is in this kind of zone, and then we get in the core of shadow, which is where the light is completely blocked. In other words, you're turning that corner, it's opposite of the light, and it's dense shadow with very little, if any, light to it whatsoever. Does that make sense? And then on the ground, you see the cast shadow, and it has a kind of course to it as well. Up underneath, you have what's sometimes referred to as a crevice shadow, or we called it a contact shadow, where the object is sitting on the page. I think that's what I referred to it as, a contact shadow. And that's where the light is, again, completely blocked out. And then as you move away from the light, or the crevice of the shadow where it's sitting on the table or contacting the table, this ambient light around the object kind of fills in and creates illumination in the cast shadow. The closer you get to the object, the more that shadow becomes dense and the more the light is blocked. But what's also happening is light is spilling around, it's hitting the surface that the object is sitting on, and then it's bouncing back up. And it's creating a reflective light. So there's a reflection happening from the table to the ball itself. Does that make sense? So, light hits here. As it turns, it blocks, and then light spills around the edges. It hits the table surface and bounces back up. And that creates this reflected light zone. I would also add that it's reflecting off of this onto the table. So the reflective light zone that's reflecting from the table is reflecting back onto the table, which is creating more reflected light in the cast shadow. Does that make sense? Any questions in Teams land out there? Okay. And you'll notice that even with a darker object, you have the highlight or the light, the midtone, the shadow, the core shadow, the cast shadow with its core shadow or contact shadow, all the way out, to this reflected light zone, and then the reflected light in here. It calls it the reflected highlight. So this just goes to show you that different artists use different nomenclature to describe the same thing. okay? Nomenclature means words. Okay, so I'm going to go to my reference image. If I can find it. And I believe I sent you guys this one. Is this the one I sent you guys? Cassandra, did I send this one? I'll check.
Yes.
Yeah, so I sent you that one plus these reference photos here. So I'm going to use a different one. All right. I hate doing this because I can't see the screen up there, so I'm going to have to turn this and get my image up here, and then to the right of screen, and to the left of screen. All right, so the first thing that you want to do is, again, using your whole arm, you want to create your sphere. So I start off with a very light line, and I gradually increase my pressure. Oh, I need to make it smaller, don't I, so I can have room for the core shadow. So there's the beauty of gesture. I'm using a blue pencil, which I don't want to do. Can I see 20 to be 4B or 60, doesn't matter. I know you guys online can barely see that, but you can see that I reduced the size of it because I want to have room for that core shadow that's being cast. So I'm going to reduce the size of it. And again, I'm trying my best to create a round shape, which is kind of hard from the side. And I'm going a little bit darker than I would have you go. That looks pretty round, just so that you guys out there can see it. All right, so the first thing that I notice is that there's a core shadow kind of in this zone, right? Stretching down to about right here. So I'm going to start by doing some cross contour marks that are hatching. And then I see some dark down here. So I'm going to put some dense hatching down there as well. Now I also see a cast shadow underneath the object. And because it's a flat surface, I'm not going to do cross contour marks. And I'll start with hatching. Now I want you to notice that I'm not doing this. I'm doing this. Do you see the difference? What's the difference in the two lines? This one's more gestural, whereas this one's more precise. Well, yeah, you can build it up by making it more dense by hatching, but you'll notice that the ends of this one are what I call closed. They're very blunt, whereas the ends of this one are very open. And what's interesting is it's dark to light. So it transitions. It has modulation of value, right, to it, whereas this doesn't have modulation of value. So as I start to see that form develop, I'm going to use a little bit of contour to give myself a separation between the figure and the ground. And I'm going to go ahead and put some hatched marks out in the ground area. And what does that do to my contour line? It makes it disappear, yes? Right? So we just get a contrasted tone that implies an edge by the outside being darker and the inside being lighter. Does that make sense? So it becomes an implied edge instead of a contoured edge. And I can use that negative space to kind of refine the edge of my form. So now that's starting to look a little bit more spherical. I like the way that that looks as far as the form is concerned. It feels a little oblong, yes? So it's not quite round. So I'm going to come in here because I feel like it's the bottom part that's not quite as round. That feels better, yes? It feels less oblong now, right? And I can go a little darker there because I know that out here, underneath it, is that crevice contact shadow underneath the ball, which is kind of like the negative space that I was doing on the top of the ball. And you can see as I move out into the reflected light zone of the shadow, my lines are very open, right? They kind of transition from being very dark to being very light. So there's a lot of swishing and flicking, right? Like in Harry Potter. All right. So I know that the ball, for the most part, is kind of a light gray. So I'm going to keep my pressure relatively light and keep everything very open in that area. You know, a lot of reserve showing. Does that make sense? Versus in here, I'm going to get denser and denser. And as I get into that core shadow, my lines become very dense. Does anybody see anything starting to happen there as far as tone, mass and dimensionality? Yes? Like it's starting to become light and shadow as far as form is concerned. Notice I didn't draw an outline around the ball, right? It's more about tone. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit darker out here. Now notice that I'm not like just going up to the edge. I'm drawing over the edge a little bit in some cases. We can still see the edge. You see how by making the area outside of the ball darker, it makes the ball seem what? Lighter, right? So I see a little bit of a gray up in here. My highlight's about right there, right? Be a little bit down. I'm just going to kind of mark that place, right? You can see how I'm going back over the reflected light area because is the reflected light area in here as light as this area in here? No. it's grayer. And in fact, as we get towards the edge, we get another cast shadow. And it's the combination of the core shadow in here with this other core shadow that's on the bottom right edge of the shape that starts to make that reflected light appear. Does that make sense? So I'm just observing very carefully, you know, the dark here and the dark here. And I'm pushing it a little bit, meaning I'm making it a little bit darker than it needs to be. Now, if you start to get too sharp of an edge, you can just do some hatched lines or some kind of stipple hatching so that it just doesn't cut off at the edge of the shadow, but transitions into the object itself. Is that making sense to everybody? And at this point, you have to sharpen your pencil. Now, something that I notice is that over here, we start to kind of lose the edge of that form a little bit. Meaning we don't have as focused an edge as we do over here. It's much softer. So I can hatch over that edge right into the shape from the negative. I'm going to put a table edge back here. So we can have a softer edge versus a harsher edge. And if you look at the image on the screen, you can see that it's softer right here if you squint. In other words, there's a passage from the negative space into the positive space through this soft edge. And that means the values outside and inside are similar. Does that make sense? Versus over here where they're very different from one another. Now, when you get into the core shadows, what can you basically do? Elijah, what can you basically do when you get into the core shadow, that crevice shadow, that contact shadow?
Add more hatching?
And really make it dense to where it's almost black.
Oh, okay.
You see that? Where I'm almost completely blocking out the surface of the reserve.
Oh, okay.
So like out here, I might continue to do just hatching. But as I get into that core shadow or that crevice shadow or that contact shadow, I can do cross hatching to really get it dense. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, that looks pretty good. Yeah? All right. So what else should we do? I'm going to come in here and kind of push that darker. Maybe I'll push all of this negative space darker out here. Now I want you to look. Oh no, Professor Wilson went over the edge. He's an idiot. I can get that edge right back. Just by darkening the negative space. right? The main thing is you don't have to do this. You can be pretty free as long as you don't go haywire with it, right? Now, how am I going to get this lighter? How am I going to make something lighter? What would be necessary to make a light thing lighter when it's against a lighter surface? Huh? You could erase, but we're not going to do that. Make the area around it darker. So if I start here, and I go slightly darker around it, does that start to make it look lighter? Does that make sense? So in order to make something like in the, I keep thinking I'm on the computer, in here, lighter, we have to go a little bit darker. And I think if you look closely at the photograph, you can see that indeed it is a little bit darker around that reflected light. Does that make sense to everybody? See how that starts to make it lighter? Huh? Yes? And then if it looks too much, we can transition out back into the light area that we have reserved in here. I also want you to notice that down here, it's a very soft edge. It's not really harsh. So we can draw over the negative shape or out of the negative shape into the positive shape. All right, question? No? How about out there? Are there any questions?
No, sir.
Lauren? Yes. Go ahead. Whoever was talking. Oh, you said no, sir. Okay. Gotcha. All right. Well, let's pull open your reference photograph on your phone or your device or whatever it is, the one that I sent you, and draw it the same way that I did. I'm just going to kind of work on mine a little bit more, as you guys work on yours. I'm going to use a little bit of contour line around the edge of that. Remember, when your pencil starts becoming dull in an area where you want to be delicate, you probably should sharpen your pencil. And you can see that I drew it really big on the page. So, you know, same motive that we've had previously, where we want to draw with our arm, not with our wrists.
Sir,
Huh?
are we supposed to use the ball reference photo you sent us, or any of the reference photos you sent us?
The sphere.
Oh, the sphere. Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, just that one. We may not get to the other stuff today. We may just do this today. Now on your reference photo, you see some like little nicks and stuff, like little textures. Don't worry about those as much as worrying about the general idea of creating the course of shadow that you see. And even if you weren't going to draw those using hatching, you would do it later. You wouldn't do it now. You would do this big general course of shadow first. And then you would put down the little textures, refining some of the edges. Big movements out into that negative space to gray it down. Big movements on the table to gray it down, big hatching marks. I'm going to focus a little bit more on this edge here to make it darker. Really get up underneath that contact area. Why do I have the feeling that I didn't use the word contact the other day? Cassandra, do you remember what I called that the other day? Or anybody? I think I called it contact shadow.
I think you did.
Okay. I'm going to go really dense in the middle of that shadow and create a nice core shadow there, which is going to make my ball seem that much rounder. I'm going to really push the negative space behind the table. But I want you guys to notice that in the beginning, my ball was not shaped correctly. In other words, it wasn't very round, but I used the negative space in the shadows and just the course of shadow on the shape itself to refine that shape and to make it look better, rounder. I think my reflected light needs to be a little bit grayer. So I'm going to push my core shadow a little bit more up into here because I can see that a little bit more in my reference image. And then I'm going to draw over my reflected light some hatch marks to kind of calm it down a little bit so that it's not quite so heavy. really soften that edge right there at the bottom edge of the ball by making the two tones, the inside of the ball and the outside of the cast shadow, more similar, so that I get a passage through this zone like I have a passage through this zone. Feels like that needs to go up a little bit. That other shadow there. And I've got a mess here. I'm going to contour line it to round that out. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording. So again, one thing that I like to do, and I think if you go back and watch the process that I used to arrive at what I arrived at, I like to kind of establish a light gray everywhere. And then once I've got that, I go for the darks. So I kind of work from dark to light. Once I've got that gray kind of establishing, or light gray kind of establishing tone. So I really push the darks where they are, because I know, for instance, in this crevice / contact shadow, I can go a lot darker confidently, without hesitation. And, you know, obviously it's probable that even in this particular example that I'm working from, I can go a lot darker in that cast shadow. In other words, I still have room to be modulating that tone. And you can see here I've even reshaped it so it looks a little bit more like the shadow, the cast shadow that I have in my reference photo. So like, decide right now, in your head, where does my black black? Well, definitely down here. And even in here, you've got some really dark darks. Does that make sense? So to come in, the shape's pretty good. It feels a little bit compressed here, like I like that. So I would maybe see how I'm kind of making the correction there.
Yeah.
So that looks much better relative to this. And that would be the bottom edge of it. You follow me? And then you can go ahead and confidently at least go to that tonality, right? But in here, and right up against that edge, you can go ahead and give yourself a strong contour line. And you know that you can go even really super dark there. In fact, you could probably we all sound like Darth Vader. You follow what I mean? You can be more aggressive in those zones, which can help, I think, because it sets up the tonality. It's like I smudged here a little bit. That's okay. You'll notice that your hand does this already. You may notice your hand smudging things. That's okay. So what I was telling her is go ahead and decide where that edge is going to be. And even if you just work kind of piecemeal. Okay, there's a little bit of dark there. There's a little bit of dark there. Follow what I mean? There's a little bit of dark out here. So you're kind of setting up anchor points of darkness. Okay. So what I'm noticing in the classroom is when you get to a certain point, it just kind of looks bad. Not because it's a bad drawing, but because we haven't progressed it to the place where it needs to be progressed to. So go ahead at this point right now and say, I need to put some establishing anchor points of black outside of my form and underneath my form, right up against the edge. In the case of you guys, with your reference photo, you'll notice that even right here, it's almost solid black. In fact, it is solid black right at the edge. So you can give yourself a nice contour line through this zone and then just simply create a hatch that hides the contour line, meaning you make it so dense right in this area and underneath here and in here and out here that those edges start to show up by virtue of contrast. And if you put in your darkest darks, you kind of, as I said, have an anchor point that you can modulate from into the light and modulate towards from the light. So you need to have the lights preserved, you need to put down the dark darks, and then you bridge the lights, the middle tones, and the darks by modulating your tone. Now, you can see that, come on over here a little bit. Let me see your pencil. You can see that it feels very blunt, the transition. Now, if you squint at her drawing, it's not totally missing the mark as far as the transition. She's got light here, she's got a light gray here, she's got this kind of strap, if you will, of cast shadow and core of shadow in here. Now, the problem is that it doesn't feel like it modulates. It feels like it's just filled in with flat tones. And you said, what did you say? You said that she feels like she's going too dark, or that she's made her lines too dark in here, which if you guys look at your drawing, I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you have done the same thing, because that's just the way it happens. Now, one thing is she's using a charcoal pencil. So her charcoal pencil is going to smear a lot more, as you can see here. So at some point, you might need to come in, not to correct, but just to erase some of those smears. And that happens even with pencil. So just be aware of your media and how it behaves. So the question is, now that we have these kind of flat tones, can we modulate? Well, the first thing that I notice, and I'm going to go ahead and show you guys another little trick. if you have a sheet of paper, just a sheet of notebook paper from your sketchbook, you can come in here and you can rest your hand on that, and that will prevent the smearing of the pencil or the charcoal or whatever else you're working from. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I know for a fact that in that core of shadow, there's a really dark congestion of line, right? So I know that I can come in here and go much darker. So what I'm going to do is really close together, and then as I move out, I'm going to get further apart. And I'm going to step back and look at it. That looks pretty good. All right, now my question is this white in the photo? The only white I see is up here. So if this is not white, we need to go ahead and put some hatch marks down. And I'm going to cross hatch over the edge of that saddle of shadow. And what happens to the line when I do that? This line that was there, what happens to it? It disappears. So it transitions. You see that, how that happened? So all I did was put some hatch marks at that edge. I can do it here too. There's an edge, I can put some hatch marks. I can do it here too. Just use, I'll go in the same direction you're going. More broken, shorter, lighter pressured lines. Just said I'd go in the same direction. And that will make our transition more subtle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not about going too dark. It's about recognizing, oh, I've got an edge here. As long as I keep my white white and make my darks black where they are, you'll be okay. You can always make the transitions happen. Okay? Does anybody online have any questions? All right, so the thing that I want you to notice is if I zoom in real quick, this is what you have to be careful of. You'll notice that right here, it's more about shading than it is about hatching. So we want it to be more about shading. So, and that's the wrong picture, of course. All right. So what we're going to need to do is just use more of a pressure that's intense, because that's what hatching is about. Meaning we're going to come in with the tip of our pencil, and I'm going to use this, and we're going to create a contour line to separate from the background first. And you can see that contour line that I've created around the edge here, all the way into here, helps to separate that object from the background with greater clarity. And then I want to come in and use hatching, not shading. So if I want a light gray, I just have my marks be farther apart. If I want a dark gray or black, I want my marks to be closer together. So it's more about pressure and having the lines be more apart from each other if it's gray, and closer together if it's black, that creates the transition from one tone to another, light and shadow, etc. So it's not about shading. So that's something that you guys need to be careful about. So here you can see I'm correcting his form. In other words, making it more of a circle, right, or a sphere. And then using hatching to create an implied edge instead of a linear edge. Okay? All right, so what's the homework? The homework is finish your sphere drawing, email the photo of the sphere drawing. You don't need to email the reference photo to me by the beginning of class on Wednesday. Entitle them as follows: first name, last name, sphere. And in the subject line, write sphere. So that's all your homework is to finish these drawings. And then we're going to actually critique them at the beginning of class on Wednesday. And then we'll move into the next part of this part 2 of the hatching. Are there any questions out there?
Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Sure.
So do you want us to fill up the entire background of the sphere with hatching marks, or?
No, I think that kind of like I have, just a transition from dark to light would be appropriate.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, that makes sense.
So, I mean, I did kind of complete the drawing, if you will, but I didn't fill in every bit of space with a dense tone. I just kind of transitioned from around the ball outward to a lighter tone. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other questions? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm done.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question.
Go ahead, Elijah.
So when are we starting the ink part? Is that after this?
I think we're not going to do the ink at this particular moment in time. We are going to do it, just not for this particular project.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, because I need to get some containers for you guys, and I haven't been able to do that.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, we'll see on Wednesday. So, real quick, Ryan, before you leave.
Have a good day, sir.
Have a good day. We'll talk.